The security guard's hand moved to his gun the moment he saw my son's faces. Min-Jae Sajangnam has visitors, he murmured into his earpiece, his eyes darting between the boys and the portrait on the wall. That's when I knew, after 11 years of hiding across an ocean, we were about to shatter everything he'd built. Sung's voice cut through the champagne-soaked laughter like a blade through silk. Mom, that's the man from the photos you hid. Hae-Won's breath caught in his throat. His son's small finger pointed directly at the massive portrait hanging behind bulletproof glass above the bar. Min-Jae in three-piece Armani, his expression carved from marble, dark eyes that had once looked at Hae-Won like he was the only person in the world. Before duty. Before cruelty. Before 11 years of silence. Sung, quiet, Hae-Won whispered, but it was already too late. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers and tell me where you're watching from. The security guard nearest them had heard. His hand moved from his hip to his earpiece in one fluid motion, his gaze snapping between the portrait and the two boys who could have stepped out of the frame itself. The resemblance wasn't subtle. It was damning. Across the ballroom, through the sea of designer suits and blood-soaked money, Min-Jae stood with a champagne flute raised mid-toast to the bride and groom. His profile was exactly as Hae-Won remembered. Sharp enough to cut, beautiful enough to destroy. The scar through his left eyebrow was new, a thin white line that somehow made him more dangerous. Then Min-Jae turned. Their eyes met across 30 meters of marble and malice, and Hae-Won watched recognition slam into the man like a freight train. Min-Jae's hand went slack. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers in slow motion, tumbling end over end, catching light from the chandeliers like a falling star. It shattered against the floor with a sound that might as well have been a gunshot. The ballroom didn't go silent. That would have been too dramatic. But conversations lowered to hushed murmurs. Heads turned. Predators sensed blood in the water. Security descended on Hae-Won and the twins like wolves on wounded prey. 3 men in black suits materialized, hands hovering near concealed weapons, creating a wall of muscle and threat. Jiho pressed closer to Hae-Won's side, his small body trembling, but Sung stood his ground, chin lifted in defiance that was pure Min-Jae. Sir, you need to come with us. Wait. Min-Jae's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through bone. Low. Deadly. The kind of voice that had ordered executions without a second thought. He moved through the crowd with predatory grace, and the Sea of Seoul's criminal elite parted for him like he was Moses and they were the Red Sea. His second-in-command, Kong, flanked him, hand already inside his jacket. Min-Jae stopped 3 meters away. Close enough that Hae-Won could see the muscle ticking in his jaw. Close enough to see the way his pupils dilated as he looked at Sung, then Jiho, then back to Hae-Won. His expression was unreadable, carved stone, nothing more. But his hands trembled. Just slightly. Just enough. Bring them to the Sakura suite. Min-Jae's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Now! Kong moved immediately, gesturing for the security detail to create a perimeter. Sajangnam, should we? Now Kong. Hae-Won's legs locked. Every instinct screamed at him to run. To grab his boys and flee through the lobby, down the marble steps, into the Seoul night where they could disappear into crowds and alleyways. He'd done it before. He could do it again. London had been safe. London had been quiet. But then Sung's hand tightened in his. Not with fear, with hope. His 10-year-old son looked up at him with those Min-Jae eyes and whispered in English. Mom, it's okay. We came here for this, remember? Jiho nodded against Hae-Won's side, his voice smaller but just as determined. We want to meet him, even if he's scary. Hae-Won's heart shattered and reformed in the space of a single breath. He'd spent 11 years protecting them from rejection. 11 years teaching them Korean so they'd know half their heritage, even if they never met the man who gave it to them. 11 years building walls around his own trauma so it wouldn't bleed onto his sons. And now they were asking him to be brave. I can't break his heart again. The thought was a knife between his ribs. Sung had already been disappointed once when Hae-Won deflected questions about his father. Jiho had cried himself to sleep wondering if they were unwanted. If Hae-Won ran now, he'd be proving every fear his sons ever had. So he didn't run. He met Min-Jae's unreadable gaze across the shrinking distance and forced his voice to stay steady. Lead the way. Min-Jae's expression cracked for a fraction of a second. Surprise, maybe, or something darker, before the mask slammed back into place. He turned without another word, his long coat billowing behind him like a shadow given form. and Hae-Won, hand in hand with the two boys who were about to detonate a bomb in the Seoul underworld, followed the man who destroyed him into the wolf's den. The Sakura suite sat on the hotel's 42nd floor, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows that turned Seoul into a glittering web of lights and shadows. Hae-Won had forgotten how beautiful this city looked from above. How deceptive. Every pinprick of light represented a business, a family, a life that existed under the iron grip of men like Min-Jae. A kingdom built on blood and fear, dressed up in neon and glass. Sung and Ji-ho pressed their faces against the window, momentarily distracted by the view. Hae-Won wished he could join them in their childish wonder, but his body was locked in survival mode, every nerve ending screaming danger. Kong closed the door with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell locking. He was a compact man with silver threading through his black hair and eyes that had seen too much death to flinch at anything. He set a metal case on the marble coffee table and snapped it open with clinical efficiency. DNA test, Kong said simply, pulling out sterile swabs. His voice held no judgment, just cold pragmatism. Results in 2 hours. Sung looked at Hae-Won, uncertainty finally creeping into his expression. Hae-Won nodded, giving permission he didn't feel authorized to give. Kong was gentle, surprisingly so, as he swabbed the inside of each twin's cheek, labeling the samples with the kind of precision that came from years of handling evidence. Bodies. Secrets. Min-Jae stood by the window, his back to them, hands clasped behind him like a general surveying a battlefield. He hadn't said a word since they entered. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft sound of Kong sealing the samples and the twins' nervous breathing. "I'll rush these to the lab," Kong murmured, glancing at Min-Jae's rigid spine. "Sejangnam, leave us." Kong hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Hae-Won to realize that even Min-Jae's most trusted lieutenant was worried about what might happen in this room, before he nodded and slipped out. The door clicked shut. Min-Jae turned, and the weight of his attention was like gravity intensifying. He moved slowly, deliberately, circling the sofa where Hae-Won stood with his sons pressed against his sides. A wolf assessing prey. His footsteps were silent on the plush carpet, but Hae-Won felt every step like a drumbeat against his ribs. "Explain." Min-Jae's voice was arctic. "Every detail." Hae-Won's hands trembled, so he shoved them into his pockets where his sons couldn't see. His voice, when it came, was steadier than he felt. "You want the timeline? I want the truth." "Fine." Hae-Won lifted his chin, meeting those dark eyes that had once looked at him with something other than cold fury. 11 years ago, your father gave you an ultimatum. Marry Yuna or watch me die. You chose correctly, strategically. You came to my apartment and told me I was nothing. A heat-drunk mistake. That you'd fucked me because I smelled sweet, not because you felt anything real. Min-Jae's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I left that night. Took the first train to the airport. I was on the Heathrow Express when the heat hit. Hae-Won's voice cracked despite his best efforts. Emergency heat. Trauma-induced. I barely made it to a hospital. They sedated me, and when I woke up 3 days later, I was already pregnant. Sung's hand found Hae-Won's, squeezing tight. Ji-ho buried his face against Hae-Won's side. They'd heard parts of this story before, sanitized versions, but never the raw truth. Min-Jae had gone completely still. You were on suppressants. Suppressants fail when an Omega's body thinks it's dying. Hae-Won's laugh was bitter. Turns out being rejected by your bonded alpha counts as a survival threat. Biology doesn't care about politics. I never bonded you. No, but you scented me. Repeatedly. For 3 months. My body didn't know the difference. Hae-Won's composure was fracturing, anger bleeding through the cracks. I found out I was carrying twins when I was 12 weeks along, living in a hostel in Camden, working 3 jobs to afford prenatal vitamins. I thought about terminating. Every single day. But I couldn't. They were mine. Min-Jae's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You should have told me. Told you. Hae-Won's voice rose, then dropped back to a lethal whisper when he felt his sons flinch. You told me I was nothing. Your father threatened to kill me. What exactly should I have said? Surprise, the mistake you discarded is having your children? Would you have welcomed that news, Min-Jae? Or would your father have made sure I disappeared permanently? The muscle in Min-Jae's jaw ticked. He circled closer, near enough that Hae-Won could smell his cologne. Something expensive and sharp that made his Omega instincts scream conflicting messages of danger and home. Why now? Hae-Won looked down at Ji-ho, whose eyes were squeezed shut, and Sung, who stared at his father with desperate hope. Because Jiho asked if you were dead. And I was tired of lying to children who deserved the truth. Min-Jae's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. What did you tell them about me? That you were important. That you had responsibilities bigger than us. That you didn't know they existed. Hae-Won's voice softened. That they were loved, even if you couldn't be there. You defended me. Min-Jae sounded almost confused, as if compassion was a foreign language. I defended them. They didn't need to grow up hating half of themselves. Min-Jae stared at the twins, really looked at them for the first time. Sung met his gaze head-on, defiant. Jiho peeked out from behind Hae-Won's arm, cautious but curious. How old are they? 10. They turn 11 in March. Names? Sung and Jiho. Min-Jae's expression cracked, just slightly, just enough, and Hae-Won saw the man he'd loved underneath the monster he'd become. You gave them Korean names. They're half Korean. They deserve to know that part of themselves, even if they never met you. The silence that followed was broken by Min-Jae's phone buzzing. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his expression went blank again. Kong expedited the results. They're coming now. Hae-Won's heart hammered. That was fast. I own the lab. Min-Jae's eyes never left the twins. If they're mine, everything changes. You understand that. If. Sung's voice was small but fierce. We look exactly like you. Min-Jae's gaze snapped to his son, and something dangerous and possessive flared in his eyes. Yes, you do. 11 years ago, Min-Jae had walked into the university gallery expecting another tedious evening of networking and performative charity. His father had been explicit. Attend Seoul National University's International Relations program, learn how to launder money through legitimate channels, make connections with future politicians and diplomats. 24 years old and already drowning in blood, Min-Jae wore his tailored suit like armor and his boredom like a second skin. Then he saw the painting. It was small, tucked in a corner away from the flashier pieces. A watercolor of Seoul at dawn, the city caught between darkness and light. Something about it made his chest tight. Beautiful things didn't exist in his world. Beautiful things got destroyed. You made this? The Omega standing beside the painting startled, nearly dropping his champagne flute. He was younger than Min-Jae, maybe 22, with nervous hands and eyes that hadn't yet learned to hide hope. His name tag read Hae-Won scholarship student. Ah yes. It's not very good, I'll take it. Min-Jae pulled out his checkbook, wrote an amount that made Hae-Won's eyes go wide. The dawn. Why dawn? Hae-Won's voice was soft, barely audible over the cocktail chatter. Because it's the only time the city looks peaceful. Before the world wakes up and remembers to be cruel. Min-Jae looked at this strange, soft-spoken Omega who somehow understood that beauty and violence could exist in the same breath, and felt something shift in his chest. Something dangerous. Have you eaten? 3 months. That's all they got. 3 months of stolen freedom that felt like a lifetime. Late nights at Pojangmaka, Hae-Won teaching Min-Jae that street food tasted better than Michelin stars when you were with someone who made you laugh. Philosophy debates that stretched until sunrise, Hae-Won arguing that Camus was wrong about Sisyphus, that hope wasn't absurd. It was the only thing that mattered. Min-Jae teaching Hae-Won to ride his motorcycle, hands steady on his waist, trust given without question. Hae-Won teaching Min-Jae to bake bread in his tiny student apartment, flour dusting their hair, the smell of yeast and possibility filling spaces that had only ever known emptiness. Min-Jae learned that Hae-Won worked 3 jobs to afford tuition, that he sent money home to his family in Busan, that he wanted to be a teacher, to give kids the opportunities he'd fought for, that his smile was rare but devastating, that when he said Min-Jae's name, it sounded like a prayer instead of a title. And Min-Jae, for the first time in his life, felt seen. Not as the heir to a criminal empire, just as a man who was tired of drowning. He should have known it couldn't last. Min Taeyong's office was all dark wood and darker intentions. Min-Jae stood before his father's desk like a soldier awaiting execution, while security footage of him and Hae-Won played on a silent screen. The motorcycle ride. The apartment. The kiss outside Hae-Won's building that had lasted too long, meant too much. Marry Yuna. His father's voice was granite. The Busan alliance requires it. Or I will have your Omega, the word dripped with contempt, killed in front of you. Slowly. And you will watch. Min-Jae had killed men. Had ordered executions without flinching. But the thought of Hae-Won's blood on his hands shattered something fundamental inside him. I'll do it. Good. And you'll end it tonight. Cleanly. I don't want him running to the press or the police. So Min-Jae went to Hae-Won's apartment with cruelty sharpened like a blade, because mercy would only get him killed. Hae-Won opened the door with flour still on his cheek, smiling, and Min-Jae felt his heart calcify in real time. You were nothing but a heat-drunk mistake. The words tasted like poison. I fucked you because you smelled sweet. Don't confuse that with love. Hae-Won's face drained of color. Min-Jae, what? Did you think this was real? You're a student. He gestured vaguely, encompassing the empire, the violence, the inevitability. This was fun. Now it's over. Don't contact me again. He walked away before he could see Hae-Won break. Before he could break, Hae-Won ran, threw clothes into a backpack with shaking hands, bought a one-way ticket to London with his emergency savings, and boarded the train to Incheon Airport with tears he refused to shed in public. He'd start over. He'd survived worse. He'd be fine. The heat hit somewhere between Seoul and the airport. Emergency heat. His body convulsing, fever spiking, suppressants failing catastrophically. The Omega across from him, a British businessman, caught him before he collapsed, shouting for help in accented Korean. Hae-Won remembered fragments. The ambulance, the hospital, doctors speaking in rapid Korean about trauma-induced heat, about how rejection from a scented alpha could trigger biological crisis. 3 days of sedation. When he woke, weak and disoriented, a nurse smiled gently and said, "Congratulations. You're pregnant." Hae-Won made it to London. Made it to a hostel in Camden. Made it through 12 weeks of morning sickness and night terrors before an ultrasound revealed twins. He sat in the free clinic, staring at the grainy images, and vomited into a paper bag while a kind stranger rubbed his back and promised it would be okay. It wasn't okay. But he survived anyway. Present day. Min-Jae blinked, the memory dissolving like smoke. Kong had returned with a tablet, his expression carefully neutral. Sejangnam. Results. The numbers swam before Min-Jae's eyes. 99.9% probability. Twice. 2 sons he never knew existed, standing in his suite with Hae-Won's eyes and his own face, proof that love hadn't been a mistake, just a casualty. He looked at Hae-Won, who stood rigid and terrified and defiant, and realized he'd spent 11 years becoming the monster his father wanted while the man he loved raised their children alone. "They're mine," Min-Jae said quietly. "Yes," Hae-Won whispered. "They are." The tablet screen glowed in Kang's hands like a verdict from the universe itself. Min-Jae took it without a word, his fingers steady even as something fundamental inside him began to crack. The numbers were clinical, indifferent to the chaos they represented. Sample A, Min-Jae 99.9% probability of paternity. Sample B, Min-Jae 99.9% probability of paternity. Twice. 2 sons. 2 lives he'd been absent from since their first breath. His hand trembled. Just slightly, just enough that Kong noticed and carefully looked away, granting his boss the dignity of private devastation. Min-Jae read the results 3 times, as if repetition would change reality or make it more comprehensible. It didn't. The truth remained, merciless and absolute. He'd spent 11 years building an empire on the foundation of his father's ultimatum. 11 years convincing himself that sacrificing Hae-Won had been necessary, strategic, the only way to keep him alive. 11 years believing the lie that love was weakness. And all that time, these children existed. His children. Min-Jae's gaze lifted from the screen to the velvet sofa where Sung and Jiho sat pressed together like 2 halves of the same soul. Their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles had gone white. They watched him with identical expressions. His own eyes reflected back at him, filled with a devastating combination of hope and fear that made his chest constrict. Sung's jaw was set in defiance, shoulders squared despite the tremor Min-Jae could see running through his small frame. A fighter. Jiho was softer, partially hidden behind his brother's shoulder, but his gaze never wavered. Quiet strength. They were so young, and yet they'd already learned to be brave in a world that clearly terrified them. Because of me, Min-Jae realized with sickening clarity. They're scared because I'm a monster, and they know it. He handed the tablet back to Kong without looking at him. "Leave us. No interruptions." "Sejangnam. Out." Kong hesitated only a heartbeat before bowing slightly and retreating, closing the door with a soft click that seemed to echo in the cavernous suite. Hae-Won stood behind the sofa like a sentinel, his hands gripping the back of it hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. Protective. Always protective. Min-Jae moved slowly, deliberately, crossing the space between them with measured steps. The twins watched his approach like prey watching a predator, unsure whether to run or freeze. When he reached the sofa, he did something he hadn't done in years, something his father had beaten out of him before he turned 15. He knelt, not in submission, not in surrender, but to meet them at eye level, to make himself smaller, less threatening, to show them that despite the monster he'd become, he could still remember how to be human. The plush carpet was soft beneath his knees, the position unfamiliar and strangely humbling. Up close, the resemblance was even more devastating. Sung had his jawline, the exact angle and sharpness that Min-Jae saw in the mirror every morning. Jiho had his mother's gentle features softened by Min-Jae's bone structure, creating something heartbreakingly beautiful. Both had his eyes, dark, intense, capable of cruelty or kindness depending on the day. "What are your names?" His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by emotions he'd spent a decade burying. Sung spoke first, his voice clear and steady despite the fear Min-Jae could smell on him. Sweet, sharp, distinctly Omega. "I'm Sung. This is Jiho. We're 10. We live in Camden." A pause, then defiantly, "We like football and cooking with Mom." Cooking with Mom. The domestic normalcy of it was a knife between Min-Jae's ribs. While he'd been ordering executions and negotiating territorial disputes, his sons had been living a life he couldn't even imagine. Learning to cook. Playing football. Growing up without him. Jiho's voice was softer, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of every fear a child could hold. "Are we in trouble?" The question shattered something inside Min-Jae that he'd thought was already broken beyond repair. This child, his child, was afraid that existing was a crime, that being born was something that required apology. His mask cracked. Just for a fraction of a second, but it cracked, and the man underneath, the one who'd once believed in dawn paintings and homemade bread, bled through. "No." His voice gentled in a way it hadn't in years. "You're not in trouble. But your scary friend took our spit," Sung said, still defiant, still protecting his brother. "And everyone downstairs looked at us like we were bad." "You're not bad." Min-Jae's hands flexed at his sides, wanting to reach out but uncertain if he had the right. "Those people are vipers. Killers. Monsters like me." "Wrong." Jiho leaned forward slightly, curiosity temporarily overpowering fear. "Are you really our dad?" The question was so simple, so innocent, so impossible to answer with anything but the truth. "Yes. Mom said you were important. That you had a big job." Sung's eyes narrowed, assessing. "Are you a good person?" Min-Jae almost laughed, a broken, bitter sound that caught in his throat. "How did you tell a child that their father had killed men? That he ruled an empire built on fear and violence? That he'd destroyed the only good thing in his life because he'd been too weak to fight for it?" "No," he said honestly. "I'm not." Hae-Won made a small sound of protest behind them, but Min-Jae held up a hand, stopping him. His sons deserved the truth, not comfortable lies. "But I want to be," Min-Jae continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "For you." Sung and Jiho exchanged a glance, some silent twin communication that excluded the rest of the world. Then Jiho spoke again, his small voice carrying a wisdom that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "Mom says people can change if they want to. Do you want to?" Min-Jae looked at his sons, these impossible, beautiful children who somehow carried his DNA and Hae-Won's goodness, and felt the weight of every choice he'd made crystallize into a single, defining moment. "Yes," he said. "I do. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from." The door to the Sakura suite slammed open with enough force to rattle the crystal decanters on the bar cart. Yuna swept in like a winter storm given human form, her bodyguards flanking her in perfect symmetry. Two mountains of muscle in matching black suits, hands already hovering near concealed weapons. She was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, elegant, sharp, and designed to draw blood. Her gown was ice blue silk that probably cost more than Hae-Won's annual rent, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists like captured starlight. Her face was perfectly composed, makeup applied with surgical precision, but her eyes, cold, calculating, furious, betrayed the rage simmering beneath the surface. Min-Jae rose from his kneeling position in one fluid motion, his expression shuddering back into the mask of the dawn. "Yuna, I don't recall inviting you. The entire ballroom is whispering about the Omega and his bastards who look exactly like you." Her voice was cultured, controlled, each syllable sharp enough to cut. "Did you really think I wouldn't come to see the mess you've made?" Her gaze swept over Hae-Won with visible disgust, lingering on his hand-stitched suit and worn shoes before landing on the twins with something close to revulsion. So the rumors are true. You kept whores from your past. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Hae-Won's face went pale, his hands instinctively moving to pull his sons closer, but Sung stepped forward before he could stop him. The boy planted himself between his mother and Yuna's venom, his small frame somehow commanding despite being dwarfed by the adults around him. Please do not speak about my parent that way. Sung's Korean was perfect, not just fluent, but formal, the respectful speech patterns of someone who'd studied the language with dedication and care. It's disrespectful. The room went silent. Even Kong, who'd returned at some point during the confrontation and stood near the bar, looked shocked. Yuna's perfectly composed expression cracked, her eyes widening fractionally as she processed what she'd just heard. One of her bodyguards shifted uncomfortably. Min-Jae felt something fierce and possessive flare in his chest. His son, this 10-year-old child who should be terrified, was defending his mother in a language he had no reason to know, using formal speech that most Korean children struggled with. Yuna's shock morphed into fury. A child teaching me manners? How dare! We learned Korean because Mom said even if we never met you, we should know where half of us comes from. Jiho's voice was quieter than his brother's, but no less steady as he stepped up beside Sung, forming a united front. His Korean was equally flawless, equally formal. He taught us about Chuseok and Seoul, about hanbok and kimchi, about family honor. The last two words, family honor, landed like a slap across Yuna's face. She stared at the twins as if they'd materialized from thin air, her carefully constructed worldview visibly fracturing. These weren't supposed to be people. They were supposed to be problems, obstacles, things to be eliminated. But they stood there speaking her language, invoking concepts she'd been raised to value, looking at her with Min-Jae's eyes and an Omega's quiet strength, and she couldn't reconcile it. Hae-Won's voice was barely a whisper. Boys, it's okay. No, Mom. Sung's chin lifted in defiance. You said we should always stand up for what's right. She's being mean to you. That's not right. Yuna's expression hardened back into cold calculation. She turned away from the children as if they were beneath her notice, focusing the full weight of her attention on Min-Jae. This will ruin everything we've built. The Busan alliance, the truce with the Russians, the political connections your father spent decades cultivating. Her voice dropped to a lethal whisper. Our engagement was announced 3 months ago. The wedding is in 6 weeks. Every major family in Seoul will be watching. She took a step closer, her perfume, something expensive and sharp, filling the space between them. If you acknowledge these children, you're telling the entire underworld that you're weak, that you can be manipulated through sentiment. Our enemies will use them against you. Against us. Min-Jae's jaw tightened. They're my sons. They're leverage. Yuna's eyes were glacial. And the second you claim them publicly, they become targets. Every rival family will see them as your weakness. They'll never be safe. Neither will their mother. It was the truth. Cold, brutal, undeniable. Min-Jae knew the underworld's rules better than anyone. Sentiment was a liability. Love was a weapon your enemies used to destroy you. His father had taught him that lesson carved into his skin. Yuna pressed her advantage, reading his hesitation. Send them back to London with enough money to disappear. Keep them hidden, keep them safe. But if you stand beside them publicly, she gestured toward the twins, then toward the windows overlooking Seoul. You'll start a war you're not ready for. The Busan family will see it as betrayal. The Russians will see it as weakness. And your father. My father, Min-Jae interrupted, his voice deadly quiet, doesn't make my decisions anymore. Yuna's perfect composure cracked wider. Don't be a fool. You know what's at stake. Your empire, your reputation, everything you've built. Choose now. Her final words were barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of an ultimatum. Them or everything else. You can't have both. Min-Jae looked at his sons, Sung still standing protectively in front of his mother, Jiho gripping his brother's hand, both of them trying so hard to be brave. Then at Hae-Won, who watched him with eyes that held no expectation, no hope, just weary resignation. As if he'd already accepted the rejection that was coming. As if he'd been preparing for it for 11 years. And Min-Jae realized that Yuna was wrong. He couldn't have both. But he knew which one he refused to lose again. The doors burst open for the second time in 10 minutes, but this entrance carried a different weight. The kind of authority that came not from beauty or ambition, but from decades of spilled blood and unanswered bodies. Min-Jae strode in with the confidence of a man who'd built an empire on corpses, his silver hair swept back, his tailored suit immaculate. Min Soo-jin followed half a step behind, her traditional hanbok a statement of old-world values in a modern setting, her face carved from the same unforgiving stone as her husband's. Behind them came the enforcers, 6 men in black suits who'd killed for the Min family without question, without mercy, without hesitation. The old guard had arrived, and the temperature in the suite dropped 10 degrees. Kong moved immediately to intercept, but Taeyong waved him off with the casual dismissal of someone who viewed human beings as furniture. His eyes swept the room, cataloging Yuna's fury, the twins' wide-eyed terror, Hae-Won's protective stance, and finally landing on his son with something close to disgust. I told you to eliminate this problem 11 years ago. Taeyong's voice was granite scraping against steel. You were weak then. Don't compound it now. Min-Jae's expression remained neutral, but Hae-Won saw his hands curl into fists at his sides. Father, don't. Taeyong cut him off with a gesture. I don't want excuses. I want this mess cleaned up. Tonight. Soo-jin moved toward the twins with the predatory grace of a woman who'd spent her life navigating shark-infested waters. Her hanbok rustled with each step, the traditional silk somehow making her approach more menacing, not less. She stopped 3 feet away, her nose wrinkling as if she'd encountered something rotting. Male omega filth bred more male omega filth. Her voice dripped with contempt. Disgusting. Sung flinched but held his ground. Jiho pressed closer to his brother, his small hand finding Sung's and gripping tight. Hae-Won felt rage flood his system. Hot, protective, desperate. But before he could move, before he could put himself between his children and this woman's venom, Sung stepped forward. The boy's movements were careful, deliberate. He'd clearly practiced this. His hands came together, his spine straightened, and he executed a perfect formal bow. The kind reserved for elders, the kind that showed respect even when it wasn't deserved. Grandmother, Sung said in flawless Korean, his voice trembling but determined. It's an honor to meet. Soo-jin recoiled as if he'd struck her, her face contorting with revulsion. Don't touch me with your dirty blood. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Sung froze mid-bow, his face crumpling, all that careful composure shattering in an instant. Jiho made a small, wounded sound, and Hae-Won felt something inside him break so completely that he wondered if he'd ever be whole again. We shouldn't have come. Hae-Won's voice was raw, barely controlled. His protective instincts were screaming at him to grab his sons and run, to get them away from these people who looked at his children like they were garbage to be discarded. This was a mistake. We're leaving. He reached for the twins, ready to scoop them up and flee, ready to book the next flight back to London where they were safe, where no one looked at his boys with hatred in their eyes. His hands found their shoulders, already pulling them toward the door. But Jiho's small hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, holding tight with surprising strength. Mom, wait. Jiho's voice was quiet but firm, his eyes still fixed on his grandmother who stood there radiating disgust. I want to tell them something. Baby, no. Hae-Won tried to pull him closer, to shield him from whatever was coming next, but Jiho planted his feet. Please, Mom. I practiced. Jiho's voice cracked on the last word, tears pooling in his eyes but not falling. For years. In case we ever met them. Hae-Won's heart shattered. Practiced. His son had been practicing a speech for grandparents who might never want him, might never acknowledge him, might look at him exactly like this, with revulsion and hatred. And still he wanted to try. Jiho. Min-Jae's voice was rough, warning, but the boy ignored him. Sung stepped beside his brother, shoulders squared despite the tear tracks on his cheeks. We both want to say it. Taeyong laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. Let them speak, then. Let them embarrass themselves before we end this farce. Soo-jin's expression remained carved from ice, but she tilted her head slightly, granting permission with the magnanimity of a queen observing amusing entertainment from peasants. Hae-Won wanted to stop this. Wanted to grab his boys and run before they could be hurt any more than they already had been. But when he looked down at their faces, Sung's defiant, Jiho's determined, he realized they needed this. Not for their grandparents. For themselves. So he let go. Jiho reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn notebook, its edges soft from years of handling. The cover was decorated with careful drawings of Korean symbols and phrases, clearly hand-drawn by a child. He opened it with trembling fingers, and Hae-Won recognized his own handwriting filling the pages. translations, cultural notes, recordings transcribed with painstaking care. "We learned something," Jiho began, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Something Mom said was important. Something that made you who you are." Sung took a breath, and together, in perfect unison, the twins began to recite. And the room went deathly silent. "Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from." Jiho's hands trembled as he held the notebook open, its pages yellowed with age and handling, covered in Hae-Won's careful handwriting. Korean characters mixed with English translations, phonetic guides, and small notes in the margins. "This is important, and practice this one, and your heritage, my loves." The boy's voice started soft, uncertain, but then something shifted. His spine straightened, his chin lifted, and when he spoke, it was in formal, archaic Korean that belonged to a different era. The kind of Korean that existed in historical texts and family shrines, not in modern conversation. "Hayalo minda. Bulo tandanda." The words rolled off Jiho's tongue with reverence. "In blood we are bound. In fire we are forged." Taeyong's expression flickered. Just slightly, but it was enough. Recognition. Shock. Jiho continued, his voice growing stronger, and Sung joined him, their voices harmonizing in perfect unison, as if they'd practiced this moment 1,000 times. "Minun hyol jakinda, madun jiagiro budio. Minun chulswa jianti ui guanjiarial jongjunghanda." A Min protects his blood above all enemies. A Min honors the bonds of birth and battle. The twins' voices cracked with emotion, tears streaming down their faces, but they didn't stop. They stood there before people who hated them and recited words that should have been their birthright, that should have been taught to them by their grandfather in ceremony and pride, not scavenged from old texts by a desperate Omega trying to give his children something to hold on to. "Minun Gioldi jjui saramdalyul biarigi anunda." A Min never abandons his own. The final words hung in the air like an accusation, like a prayer, like a weapon forged from hope and defiance. The twins stood there, hands clasped, tears cutting paths down their cheeks, chests heaving with the effort of not breaking down completely. The suite had gone completely silent. Even the enforcers looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Yuna's perfect composure had cracked entirely, her mouth slightly open in shock. Kong stared at the twins as if seeing them for the first time. But it was Taeyong's face that had transformed most dramatically. The patriarch of the Min family, the man who'd built an empire on ruthlessness and cold calculation, looked as if he'd been struck. His hand trembled slightly where it gripped his walking cane, a purely decorative affectation that housed a concealed blade, and his voice, when it came, was hoarse. "Where did you learn that?" Jiho wiped at his tears with the back of his hand, smearing them across his cheeks. "Mom recorded it." His voice was small again, childlike, stripped of the formal authority he'd summoned for the recitation. He found old texts online and in libraries. He transcribed them and made recordings so we could practice the pronunciation. Sung's voice joined his brother's, equally raw. "He taught us even though he said you'd probably never want to meet us. He said we should be proud of where we came from anyway. That being half Korean was a gift, not a..." His voice broke. "Not a mistake." All eyes turned to Hae-Won, who stood behind his sons with his hands clenched so tightly his nails were drawing blood from his palms. His face was wet with tears he hadn't realized he was crying, his chest heaving with the effort of not screaming at these people who'd looked at his children, his beautiful, brave, perfect children, with revulsion. "How dare I?" Hae-Won's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried like thunder in the silent room. "How dare I teach your grandsons to honor a family that would rather see them erased? How dare I raise them to be proud of blood you call dirty?" His voice rose, control fracturing under the weight of 11 years of grief and rage and desperate love. "They asked about you. Every year. Why doesn't our dad want us? Are we bad? Is it because we're different?" Hae-Won's breath hitched. "And I lied. I told them you were important, that you had responsibilities, that you didn't know they existed. I defended you. I taught them your language, your culture, your oath, the same oath you're using to reject them." Taeyong's mask had slipped entirely. He stared at the twins, at the notebook in Jiho's hands, at his son who stood frozen between his past and his future. "That oath hasn't been recited in full formal speech in 40 years. Not since my father's funeral." "I know." Hae-Won's laugh was broken, bitter. "I found it in a digitized archive of historical family documents. Spent 3 months translating it, practicing pronunciation with native speakers online, recording it over and over until I got it right. Because I wanted my sons to know that they came from something meaningful. That their blood, he spat the word, dirty as you call it, carried honor. Sujin had gone pale, but her fury was barely contained. You had no right. I had every right. Hae-Won's voice cracked like a whip. I'm their parent. I raised them alone while you, he pointed at Min-Jae, built your empire, and you, his finger swung to Taeyong and Sujin, pretended they didn't exist. Sujin's face contorted with rage. She took 2 steps toward Jiho, who still clutched the notebook like a shield, and raised her hand high. You are nothing, abominations using words you have no right to. Her palm swung down toward Jiho's face, and everything happened at once. Hae-Won lunged forward with a protective snarl. Sung threw himself in front of his brother. Kong moved toward the commotion. But it was Min-Jae who got there first. His hand caught his mother's wrist mid-swing, inches from Jiho's face, and the sound of flesh meeting flesh echoed like a gunshot in the suite. Sujin gasped, her eyes going wide with shock. Her son had never touched her in anything but respect. Min-Jae's voice was so quiet it was almost gentle, but the violence underneath it was unmistakable. Touch my son again and you'll lose that hand. The room went absolutely still. Min-Jae's grip on his mother's wrist was iron, his fingers wrapped around the delicate bones with enough pressure to bruise but not break. Sujin's face had gone from fury to shock to something approaching fear in the span of a heartbeat. The entire room had frozen. Enforcer's mid-step, Kong half-raised from his defensive crouch, Hae-Won caught between his sons and the threat, even the twins holding their breath. Then Min-Jae's free hand moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd drawn a weapon 1,000 times, and suddenly there was a gun, matte black, compact, deadly, held with casual familiarity in his grip. But it wasn't pointed at Hae-Won. It wasn't pointed at the twins. It wasn't even pointed at Yuna. It was aimed directly at his father's chest. The ultimate taboo. The unforgivable sin. In the underworld, you could betray allies, murder rivals, burn entire organizations to the ground. But you never raised a weapon against your own blood. Never threatened the patriarch who'd given you life and power and purpose. Taeyong's face went completely still, carved from granite, but his eyes betrayed him. Widening just slightly, pupils contracting as he calculated odds and outcomes, and the son he thought he'd molded into his perfect heir. Get out! Min-Jae's voice was conversational, almost gentle, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Min-Jae, Sujin's voice was strangled, her wrists still caught in her son's unbreakable grip. You can't be serious. Out! The word cracked like a whip. Taeyong found his voice, and it dripped with venom. You'd choose a whore's bastards over your family? Over the empire I built? Over everything I gave you? Min-Jae's laugh was cold enough to frost glass. Family. He repeated the word as if tasting poison. That child, he nodded toward Jiho without taking his eyes or his weapon off his father, is my family. You're just the people who taught me that love was a weakness to be carved out. That sentiment was a disease. That the only thing that mattered was power. His voice dropped to something like winter itself, beautiful, merciless, deadly. You were wrong. Taeyong's face mottled with rage. I made you. You made a monster. Min-Jae's gun hand remained perfectly steady. And now that monster is telling you to leave before I forget you're my father. The threat hung in the air, undeniable and absolute. The enforcers looked at each other, uncertain. They'd pledged loyalty to Taeyong, but Min-Jae was the heir, the future, and he was holding a gun on the man they were supposed to protect. Loyalty versus survival. It was no contest. Sujin's voice was shrill. You'll regret this. The families will turn on you. The alliances will crumble. You'll have nothing. Min-Jae released her wrist with enough force that she stumbled backward into her husband's arms. I already had nothing. Now I have something worth protecting. He turned to Yuna, who'd been watching the scene unfold with the calculated assessment of someone running cost-benefit analysis in real time. The engagement is over. Tell your father I'll expect retaliation. I'll be ready. Yuna's expression was surprisingly calm, almost impressed. You just started a war over an omega you abandoned. No. Min-Jae's voice was certain, final. I just started a war over my children. Yuna studied him for a long moment, then smiled, something sharp and knowing. You know, I almost respect this. It's stupid, suicidal, and will probably get you killed. But it's honest. She adjusted her diamond bracelet with deliberate care. My father will demand blood for this insult. The Busan family doesn't forgive broken contracts. I know. And you're choosing this anyway? Min-Jae looked at his sons, Sung still protective, Jiho still clutching that worn notebook, and something in his expression softened. Yes. Yuna nodded once, accepting the verdict. Then I hope they're worth dying for. She turned on her heel, her bodyguards falling in behind her. For what it's worth, Min-Jae, you would have been a terrible husband anyway. Too much conscience. She left without another word, the door closing behind her with quiet finality. Taeyong's voice was ice and fury. You're dead to me. Good. Min-Jae's gun finally lowered, though his finger stayed near the trigger. The feeling's mutual. Sujin made a sound like a wounded animal. We gave you everything. You gave me nothing I wanted and everything I didn't need. Min-Jae gestured toward the door with his weapon. You have 10 seconds to leave before I forget the years you fed and clothed me. Taeyong drew himself up with rigid dignity. When this falls apart, and it will, don't come crawling back. You'll find no mercy from me. I'm not looking for mercy. I'm looking for the door. The patriarch of the Min family, the man who'd ruled Seoul's underworld for 40 years, turned and walked out with his wife and enforcers trailing behind him like a funeral procession. The door closed. The silence that followed was deafening. Min-Jae stood there for a long moment, his gun still in his hand, his chest heaving with adrenaline and decision and the weight of bridges burned beyond repair. Then, slowly, he holstered the weapon and turned to face what remained. Hae-Won stood frozen, his sons pressed against his sides, all three of them staring at Min-Jae as if he'd just performed a miracle or committed an atrocity, possibly both. Kong had retreated to a neutral corner, his expression carefully blank. Min-Jae looked at his sons, really looked at them, and saw the fear still lingering in their eyes, the tear tracks on their cheeks, the way they trembled despite their earlier bravery. They'd just watched their father threaten their grandfather with a gun. They'd just witnessed violence spoken in quiet tones and deadly promises. And Min-Jae realized that claiming them wasn't enough. He had to show them he meant it. So for the second time that night, he knelt. But this time it was different. This time, he lowered himself to the floor completely, both knees, head bowed, hands open and empty at his sides. A posture of absolute submission that no Dawn had ever made publicly. A gesture that said, I am yours instead of you are mine. I'm sorry. His voice cracked on the words. Not for your existence. Never for that. For taking 11 years to find you. For being too weak to fight for your mother. For letting my father's poison convince me that loving you would destroy you. Sung and Jiho stared at this powerful, terrifying man kneeling before them like a penitent, and something shifted in the air. Something fragile and new and desperately hopeful. Jiho's small voice broke the silence. Does this mean you want us? Min-Jae looked up, and his eyes were wet. More than anything. Before I tell you what happens next, subscribe to Starry-Eyed Lovers, and tell me where you're watching from. 3 days after the world shattered and reformed, Min-Jae found himself sitting in a humble street cafe in Hongdae, surrounded by university students and office workers who had no idea they were sharing space with Seoul's most dangerous man. He wore jeans, actual denim, stiff and unfamiliar, and a black cashmere sweater that Kong had purchased because apparently Min-Jae didn't own anything that wasn't a three-piece suit or tactical gear. Sung and Jiho sat across from him, devouring tteokbokki and fish cakes with the single-minded focus of children who discovered a new favorite food. Red sauce stained Jiho's chin. Sung had already gone back for seconds. They looked so normal, so beautifully ordinary, that Min-Jae felt his chest constrict. So, Min-Jae cleared his throat, his hands wrapped around a coffee he hadn't touched. What subjects do you like in school? Sung looked up, cheeks bulging with food. He swallowed hastily. I like history. And PE. Jiho likes math and art. Math and art. Min-Jae tried to imagine the combination. That's different. Jiho nodded shyly. Math has patterns. Art has patterns too, just prettier ones. He's really good, Sung added with fierce protective pride. He won a competition last year. Drew the tower bridge in charcoal. Min-Jae filed away these details like precious artifacts. History. P. Math. Art. Tower bridge. Do either of you play instruments? Mom tried to teach us piano, Sung admitted. We're terrible. Hae-Won, who'd been sitting quietly beside the twins, his untouched coffee growing cold, finally spoke. You're not terrible. You're just impatient. We're terrible, Mom. Jiho's smile was gentle, teasing. It's okay. Min-Jae watched the easy affection between them. The kind of intimacy built over years of shared meals and homework and bedtime stories, and felt the weight of everything he'd missed like a physical wound. What else do you do? Besides school? Football on Saturdays, Sung said. Jiho's on my team. We're not very good. We're okay, Jiho corrected. We came in last place this season. But we had fun. Their easy banter, the way they finished each other's thoughts, made Min-Jae realize these weren't just his sons. They were people. Whole, complex individuals with histories and preferences and inside jokes he wasn't part of. The enormity of what he'd missed threatened to crush him. Hae-Won's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, quiet but firm. We're not asking you for money or protection. They just wanted to see you once. To know you were real. Min-Jae's gaze snapped to Hae-Won's face, still guarded, still waiting for rejection even after everything. Once. We can go back to London. Hae-Won's hands twisted in his lap. Disappear again. You've done enough. More than enough. Jiho's voice was so soft Min-Jae almost missed it. Dad, if us being here hurts you, we can go back. Mom said you have important work. The word dad hit Min-Jae like a bullet to the chest. This child, his child, was giving him an out, offering to disappear to make things easier, prioritizing Min-Jae's comfort over his own desperate need to be wanted. Min-Jae's composure shattered. I've killed men for lesser offenses than what I did to you both. His voice cracked, broke, reformed. Don't let me be a coward a second time. Sung's eyes went wide. Jiho's bottom lip trembled. Hae-Won's breath caught. I want this, Min-Jae continued, the words pouring out raw and desperate. I want you. All of you. I don't care about the work or the empire or any of it. He looked at his sons, at Hae-Won, at the family he'd abandoned. Please don't leave. The silence stretched. Then Jiho's small hand reached across the table and covered Min-Jae's much larger one. Okay. That single word rebuilt the world. 1 year later, London. The penthouse in Camden smelled like competing memories of home. Kimchi jjigae simmering on the stove, freshly baked scones cooling on the counter, the yeasty warmth of rising dough that Hae-Won had taught the twins to make. Min-Jae stood at the kitchen island, flour dusting his black hair and smudged across his cheek, helping Sung frost cupcakes with the intense concentration he once reserved for criminal strategy. More blue, Sung instructed. Jiho's team colors are blue and gold. Like this. Min-Jae added another swirl of frosting, clumsy but earnest. Perfect. Jiho sat at the dining table, math homework spread before him, pencil moving in confident strokes. He'd stopped flinching when Min-Jae entered room 6 months ago. Now he just smiled and returned to his calculations. Hae-Won stirred the stew, humming something soft and wordless, and Min-Jae still couldn't believe this was real. That he got to have this. That he'd been forgiven for the unforgivable. His phone buzzed. Sujin's name lit up the screen. Min-Jae wiped his hands on a towel and answered, his voice immediately cooler. Mother. Hae-Won's humming stopped. The twins looked up. Sujin's voice was strained. It's been a year. Your father, we want to meet them. Properly. You want to meet your grandsons? Min-Jae's tone was pleasant, deadly. Apologize to Hae-Won. Not to me. To him. Face to face. And mean it. Silence on the other end. Until then, you're strangers. Min-Jae ended the call. Hae-Won's eyes were soft when Min-Jae looked up. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. Later, as the sun set over London, they stood on the penthouse rooftop. Min-Jae taught the twins traditional Korean calligraphy, their brushes moving in careful strokes, ink blooming on rice paper. Hae-Won stood behind them, his hand resting on Min-Jae's shoulder. The first casual touch he'd initiated in a year of careful rebuilding. I'll spend every day earning this, Min-Jae whispered. Hae-Won's fingers tightened. Good. Because we're not going anywhere. And for the first time in 11 years, Hae-Won allowed himself to believe it was true. The end.